Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, January 12th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Ukraine is shedding blood for NATO. So this is from Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov. He said last week that Ukraine is shedding blood for a NATO mission in candid remarks about the relationship between Kiev and the Western military alliance. So he said this during an interview on Ukrainian TV last week that I missed. It only really got picked up by Russian media. And then I saw Moon of Alabama had an article about it, and a few people tweeted about it. It's a pretty interesting quote. So I'm just going to read what he said in the interview. He said, quote, "At the NATO summit in Madrid, it was clearly delineated that over the coming decade, the main threat to the alliance would be the Russian Federation. Today, Ukraine is eliminating this threat. We are carrying out NATO's mission today. They aren't shedding their blood, we're shedding ours. And that's why they're required to supply us with weapons," end quote. So his comments really reflect, the Russian view that they are not just fighting against Ukrainian forces in the war, but also against the US and NATO. Reznikov insisted that Ukraine would eventually become a NATO member and said that it was already a de facto part of the alliance since Kiev is already armed with so much advanced NATO military equipment. And it's not just them giving equipment, they're training Ukrainians, providing intelligence. So Ukraine, while they were promised eventual NATO membership in 2008, despite warnings that, it could provoke Russia, they were promised Ukraine and NATO in 2008 that they would eventually join. They have been repeatedly denied official membership in recent years. But Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, he hasn't given up. And he said on Wednesday that his country needs more than NATO's open door. This was a quote from Zelensky on Wednesday. He said, quote, "For today, just support for Ukraine from colleagues in NATO and support in the form of rhetoric about open doors is not enough for Ukraine. Namely, not enough to motivate our state and our soldiers," end quote. So again, not enough. You hear that a lot from Ukrainian officials. But it's interesting when we talk about this open door because when in the early days of the war, I mean, that's what this war was all about because the US didn't want to give Russia any kind of guarantee that Ukraine wouldn't ever join NATO. That's something Russia was looking for before the war. The US didn't do it. And Zelensky has a very interesting quote from March 2022 about him asking how he was asking, before the war, are we going to join NATO? Or are we ever going to get into NATO? And he was basically told no, but the door will remain open. So if they weren't going to admit them into NATO, why couldn't they tell Russia that, give them something in writing? That's the big question. But it's a NATO mission, according to the Ukrainian defense minister. And Reznikov, he's previously said, I should have put this in the article, that Ukraine is a testing ground for NATO weapons. And he said, come on, send us all your weapons and we'll test them out for you. Okay, so the next article here, Poland says that it's ready to send German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. So this was Poland's President Duda on Wednesday. He said that Warsaw has decided to send Ukraine a company of those German-made tanks as part of an international coalition, but right now it's not clear if Berlin has signed off on the delivery or if they will sign off on the delivery. We don't really know. Poland's eager to send them. Supplying the Leopards would mark, we've been talking a lot about tanks lately, and this would mark the first time Western-made tanks, heavy tanks, not the lighter armored infantry vehicles, were sent to Ukraine. But the delivery needs to be approved by Germany. But according to Reuters, a German government spokesman said Berlin hasn't yet received any requests from allies to send the tanks. So Duda made the comments alongside Zelensky. Duda was over in Ukraine, in Lviv, the western city. And Zelensky said that Ukraine is awaiting a joint decision from NATO allies because one country cannot provide them with a sufficient number of tanks. Ukrainian officials, Zelensky, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, he said that they need 300 tanks, which is a lot. And Poland said they're going to send a company, which is typically 10 to 14 tanks, so nowhere near that 300 number. And Duda said that more countries need to be willing to do the same. So basically, he's just saying we've decided we're going to send these, but it still needs to be agreed upon by other NATO allies. And Scholz, the German chancellor, he's previously ruled out the idea of sending the Leopard 2, but his government has, ruled things out in the past and then ended up sending them. But it's interesting. I've been pointing this out kind of all week that when Scholz was explaining his opposition to sending these tanks back in September, he said he was doing it because he wanted to prevent a direct clash between Russia and NATO. Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, he's confident that Kiev will ultimately receive these German-made tanks, and he criticized Scholz's government for being hesitant. This is a quote from him on Wednesday. He said, quote, "It's always a similar pattern. First they say no, then they fiercely defend their decision only to say yes in the end. We are still trying to understand why the German government is doing this to itself," end quote. So again, he's really just not afraid to criticize these countries that have been giving Ukraine all this support. And the British, they're discussing sending their main battle tank to Ukraine, which is the Challenger 2. And Ukrainian officials are hoping that this would inspire Germany to do the same. But according to a report from Politico, German officials said that it would have little impact on their decision making if the British did it. They said that they're ultimately going to follow the lead of the United States. So they're just waiting for Biden's word, I guess, to approve the tanks. That's kind of what it seems like now. So it looks like Scholz and the German government has changed its position and that they're going to cave to the pressure eventually to send these tanks. Question is if they're going to be willing to send as many as Ukraine wants. All right, the next one here, Zelensky. He addressed the Golden Globe Awards on Tuesday night in a video address that was pre-recorded, and he insisted that Ukraine would win against Russia and that the conflict would not turn into World War III. So when he delivered this, again, it was a pre-recorded video. It was pretty short, and he was introduced by actor Sean Penn, who has visited Ukraine several times since Russia invaded. And in his most recent visit, Penn loaned an Oscar award to Zelensky. And there's a picture of them that we have on the page of, Penn handing Zelensky the Oscar. And Zelensky is an actor himself. He had a long acting career. He was an actor and comedian before becoming president. And he's gotten quite a few visits from actors. I know Ben Stiller went over there, a few others. Anyway, so this is a quote from the speech. He said, quote, "The First World War claimed millions of lives. The Second World War claimed tens of millions of them. There will be no Third World War. It is not a trilogy. Ukraine will stop the Russian aggression on our land," end quote. So if you want to watch the video, I put the video into the article from Twitter. If you want to feel a little nauseous, see Sean Penn cry. Just such a, this is part of his PR and propaganda efforts to deliver a speech at something like this. And Zelensky, he insisted that it was clear that Ukraine was winning the war, although his comments came around the same time that the Wagner group, the Russian mercenary group, said that it made territorial gains in Donetsk, taking that town. Soledar, on Wednesday, they said they've completed taking that town. But Zelensky is insisting, in this speech that he's going to win. And throughout the war, Zelensky has delivered, dozens, probably hundreds at this point, of video speeches to parliaments and media events and other types of events like the World Economic Forum and just all sorts of events. And again, it's part of this public relations propaganda effort to secure more foreign aid. And he's done something similar. Last April, he addressed the Grammy Awards, and I remember there was discussions about him addressing the Oscars, but he didn't end up doing it. Um, but he's talking about avoiding World War III. But in the early days of the war, his message in these speeches was for the U.S. and other Western countries to close the sky over Ukraine, which means imposing a no fly zone, which would require U.S. and NATO warplanes to shoot down Russian planes and bomb missile systems inside Russia. And that action would almost certainly spark World War III and potentially nuclear war. But the no fly zone, it received very little support in Washington, with only ultra hawks favoring the idea, such as the examples I use here. Senator Rick Scott, Republican from Florida, he was in favor of it. There's a few others, and Adam Kinzinger, who is out of Congress now, he's such a hawk, one of the worst of the worst. And on his way out, he landed a job at CNN upon his exit from Congress. So, if you advocate for World War III, you could probably get a job at CNN. Okay, so the next article here, Putin names the new head of Ukraine military operations. So Putin, Russia's defense ministry, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, by the way. Russia's defense ministry announced Valery Gerasimov would take over as the chief of military operations in Ukraine. He's replacing Sergei Sorovikin, who came in September, I believe. So he was only the commander for about 3 months. Now, Gerasimov, he is the head of, I forget exactly what his title is. Kyle put it in here. He's the chief of Russia's general staff. He's the highest ranking military official. So he's really in charge of the military as it is. And now they're putting him in charge of this war. And of course, Western governments and media have all these theories about why they're doing it. I'm not really sure, but it just seems like it, he's making it, Putin and Russia's making it clear that how, it's very important, that this war, or what they call their special military operation, is very important. And that's why the head of Russia's armed forces is being put in charge there. And TASS, the Russian news agency, said that the move would help coordinate the war effort. So we'll see how all that plays out. All right, so just want to take this moment to mention again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com, and we have a great endorsement at the top of the page from John Mearsheimer, who's one of the most important voices right now amid this war in Ukraine. He's been warning for years and years that the U.S. and NATO were going to provoke a war in Ukraine by expanding NATO and being involved in Ukraine and everything. And he's one of the few voices that, just because of who he is, he's able to, if you see his videos, interviews on YouTube and stuff, they get millions of views. And it's, I think, really important what he has been saying. So it's great that he is endorsing us. And he wrote a short letter that is at the top of the page that you can go check out. And he says in his letter that in these troubled times, a flourishing antiwar.com is very much in the U.S. national interest. Basically, his message is that today, more so than when he came of age during the Vietnam War, there's a lot less room for dissent in media, and there's a lot less institutions that are challenging the status quo. So that's why you should support antiwar.com. So listen to John Mearsheimer. Go to antiwar.com/donate and help us out. We're entirely reliant on our readers, and we need your support to keep going, to keep all this coverage that I do and that our whole team does, and all the viewpoints and opinion pieces, and just, keep the whole ship running. So antiwar.com/donate. All right, next one here is a big one, I think. The U.S. and Japan announced steps to strengthen military cooperation against China. So the U.S. and Japan on Wednesday announced these steps to, strengthen their military alliance. And this was after Lloyd Austin and Antony Blinken, they met with their Japanese counterparts in Washington in a meeting they call the 2+2. It's the defense ministers and the foreign ministers holding a meeting. And the meeting came after Kishida announced his plan to double his military budget and rolled out a new national security strategy that names China its top challenge, very similar to the language used in the US national defense strategy. And that was noted in a joint statement between these four officials. They said, quote, the ministers welcomed the release of their respective national security strategies and national defense strategies and confirmed unprecedented alignment of their vision, priorities, and goals, end quote. So I think that line's pretty important. Unprecedented alignment. So Japan seems to be all in on the US approach to China. I mean, clearly they are with this big military buildup. And the officials said that they agreed, basically that China was a threat. The way that they put it is that China seeks to reshape, the international order to its benefit. They're always talking about this rules based order, which basically means, the US led world order. And they view China as a threat to that. At a press conference, Lloyd Austin reaffirmed that Japan falls under the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, basically saying, actually, I'm going to read the quote because the way he worded it, he made sure to put China into the sentence with the nuclear warning. He said, quote, Japan and the United States remain united in our concerns over China's destabilizing actions. And I want to reaffirm the United States' ironclad commitment to defend Japan with the full range of capabilities, including nuclear, end quote. So, just the fact that he's mentioning China right before he says that says something, I think. And the U.S. welcomed Japan's plans to gain counterstrike capabilities by purchasing U.S.-made Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of about 1,000 miles. Acquiring the weapons breaks from Japan's post-World War II constitution that restricted its military to self-defense capabilities. The officials formally announced a plan to deploy Marine Littoral Regiment. So I went over that yesterday. That's these Marines that they're going to deploy to Okinawa. And that is a prefecture of Japan where many locals are opposed to the U.S. military presence, the very heavy U.S. military presence. And their goal is to deploy the Marines by 2025. And the units are going to be armed with anti-ship missiles and other lightweight equipment so they can move quickly around the islands. And this regiment is going to consist of about 2,200 Marines. And again, it's not clear. There's so many Marines in Japan, about 18,000. They're going to send more or reorganize the ones that are there. And these officials highlighted the temporary deployment of a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone to the Kanoya Air Base in southern Japan's Kagoshima Prefecture. So that is in the south on the East China Sea, which is a pretty tense area between Japan and China. And, China's probably going to respond to all this by, we've seen them really increase their military activity around Taiwan in response to U.S. and other Western support ramping up, in response to this Japanese military expansion and plans with the U.S., we're probably going to start to see more Chinese warships in this area. They occasionally sail near Okinawa, and there's disputed islands. The Senkaku Islands are controlled by Japan, but also claimed by China and Taiwan. And China sends Coast Guard vessels over there sometimes that anger Japan. And whenever they do that, the U.S. says, oh, we'll defend the Senkaku Islands. They just have to, get in the middle of it and say, hey, if you attack these uninhabited small islands in the East China Sea, we're going to go to war with you, China. So anyway, let's see, where was I here? So they said that the U.S. and Japan are going to soon sign a new agreement on cooperation in space. The deal is going to extend the U.S. mutual defense commitments to Japanese assets in space. This means that if a Japanese satellite gets attacked, the U.S. is, prepared to go to war over that. So we're just seeing cooperation in all these different ways. So the U.S., what they have here is a pretty major military power. Japan already has a pretty decently sized military, although it's technically a self-defense force. But by doubling its military budget, it's going to become a pretty formidable military force, this ally that the U.S. has right there by China and North Korea as well. So This is a pretty big deal, and we're going to see more of this. And actually, the next story is also about what Japan's up to. This next one here, the UK and Japan sign a landmark military agreement. So Britain and Japan signed this deal on Wednesday, while Kishida, the Japanese prime minister, was in London meeting with Rishi Sunak, the British prime minister. And this deal, it's called the Reciprocal Access Agreement. It will allow each nation to deploy troops to the other's territory. Japan signed something similar with Australia recently, and that was significant because that deal with Australia, which I think still needs to be ratified in the parliaments, so does this deal with the UK. So they're not like in effect yet. But that deal with Australia, that makes Australia the first country besides the US that's going to be able to send troops to Japan since the end of World War II. So we're seeing kind of this unprecedented post World War II things happening in a lot of different ways when it comes to Japan. So this deal was years in the making, and it's part of what Britain calls its tilt toward the Asia Pacific. That's their pivot to Asia is the tilt to Asia, and it's also a part of Japan's military buildup. They're looking to really increase cooperation with the U.S. as well as its allies, its Western and NATO and European allies. We might see some more deals like this. So Kishida visited London. He's visiting G7 nations, and it's going to bring him to Washington on Friday. He's going to meet with President Biden. And during that visit, we might see some more announcements between the U.S. and Japan. So it's something to keep an eye on, these developments. Okay, the next one. Taiwan's defense ministry reveals rare cooperation with NATO. So this on Wednesday, the Taiwanese Defense Ministry said that it has sent some of its military officers to a NATO war college in Italy, acknowledging cooperation with the Western military alliance that is sure to anger China. One Taiwanese Air Force officer, Lieutenant Colonel Wu Bongyang, he told reporters that he went to the NATO Defense College in Rome in 2021 for a 6-month course, and he insisted that this cooperation was purely academic. He said it was an academic exchange, not a military exchange. But he said they were very interested and curious about Taiwan, and he studied the same curriculum as officers from the NATO countries. So, maybe this might seem insignificant, but when it comes to the status of Taiwan, it's significant. Taiwan is known to cooperate with the U.S. military with training. They keep it pretty quiet, pretty unofficial. Although in 2021, in October 2021, for the first time, Tsai Ing-wen confirmed that there was U.S. troops in Taiwan, a small number of trainers, but it was the first time since 1979 when the U.S. severed relations with Taipei that a Taiwanese leader admitted that. So again, these small things, but they are significant. And this revelation about, Taiwan sending these officers to this college, it comes after NATO has, named China as a threat to the North Atlantic Military Alliance. They said China poses a systemic challenge to the alliance in their new strategic concept document that was issued in 2022. And NATO first made clear that it had its eyes on China in 2020, and they said at the time that the alliance was looking to build stronger partnerships in the Asia Pacific. Since then, some NATO countries have joined the U.S. in sending warships into sensitive waters near China, including France, Germany, and Britain. I should have added Canada to that too. They've been going through the Taiwan Strait, Canada. All right. Let's see. The next one here. This is from Responsible Statecraft from Connor Eccles, and this is about more of the House drama. GOP won't bird dog defense budget with these hawks at the helm. So following a week of fights in Congress, Rep. Kevin McCarthy, the new House Speaker, he managed to hammer out a deal with a small group of GOP lawmakers who opposed his bid to become Speaker of the House. The agreement, which reportedly included a promise to reverse the $75 billion boost in this year's defense budget, has been variously hailed and scorned as proof that Republicans are entering a new era on a range of issues. At least when it comes to foreign policy, however, the establishment appears to have held on to its traditional role. On Tuesday, House leadership announced the chamber's new committee chairs, and the results gave no indication that McCarthy intends to run afoul of GOP mandarins, especially when it comes to defense spending. So it seems like, just by who they are putting on chairs, that they're not going to really rock the boat at all here. Rep. Granger from Texas, he's going to take over as the chair of the powerful Appropriations Committee. And he slowly climbed the ranks of the GOP since entering Congress in 97. And her efforts culminated in her 2019 appointment as the ranking member of Appropriations. And she is a strong proponent of increasing military spending. She's praised all sorts of big spending and things like that. So basically, the message in this article is that it doesn't look like that $75 billion cut is going to happen. And even under that deal, he would have to bring it to a vote. It's not like they could just will it into existence. So it never would have really passed anyway. But it looks like that deal, when it comes to military spending, we're not really going to get anything out of it. All right, the last article here, this is from Jason Ditz. Even with truce attempts, over 500 civilians were killed across Yemen in 2022. So this past year saw more than 3,000 civilian casualties in Yemen, capping a year that saw ceasefires and attempts at peace talks. So it's estimated that 643 civilians were killed between airstrikes and explosions, with thousands wounded. So that's a good amount, considering that there's basically been this ceasefire from March to October. And even since October, there haven't been Saudi airstrikes. But they're still fighting on the ground between the Houthis, the Saudi-backed forces, UAE-backed forces. There's been shelling over the border. There's Saudi shelling across the border. There's fighting in the north. And also, in the beginning of the year, right before the ceasefire, Saudi airstrikes really spiked, and there's huge civilian casualties in the month of January. So according to these numbers, 17,734 civilians were killed over the past 7 years. But that's just in the violence. And it's probably a low estimate, because the UN estimates at least 377,000 people have died in the war in Yemen, and more than half of that is, civilians and children who starved to death and died as a result of disease because of the war. And that's a low estimate. Again, that was at the end of 2021 that they estimated that. And then there's this other report that says British and American weapons that were sold to the Saudis were traced to at least 87 deaths between January 2021 and February 2022. So in this, that's a different time period. I guess that's the year before. And I bet that's a very low estimate too, because the Saudi Air Force uses a lot of American weapons. So hopefully, again, that things can really boil over at any point here, as there's not a real ceasefire. Unfortunately, I know Oman has been really trying to mediate between the two sides, and an Omani delegation just arrived in Yemen again this week. So hopefully there's some progress there, because again, it could always really explode into something really horrible again. But that's it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder: Did Europe lie to Russia about peace? One from William Hartung over at Responsible Statecraft: Hawks blow a lot of hot air over proposed budget cuts. That's basically the response to that potential $75 billion cut, or I should say just reverting back to last year's spending levels. It's not really a cut. It's just that they increased the budget so much. Ukraine's war with Russia has nothing to do with freedom. That's from Jacob Hornberger over at the Future Freedom Foundation. One from Brian McGlinchey at his Substack: Israel's new government is a menace to American lives. Basically how it could put Americans in danger. And then the Spotlight from Ben Freeman, also Responsible Statecraft. A study about the rampant conflicts of interests at think tanks, about how so many think tanks are funded by, the arms industry and foreign governments and all that stuff. So go check out all that. Lots of reading to do. Um, that's it for me for today. You can, again, help us out, antiwar.com/donate. That's really the priority right now because we need to get this fundraiser going. I know, times have been tough for everybody. This is how we get by, and we make our content available to everybody. We never put it behind a paywall, but because of that, we're reliant on our readers to pitch in and help us get by. But that's it. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow.